Okay. Right, recording time. So we're back after a bit of a hiatus. We had some time off. There's some kind of background reasons going on now, but I think we're ready to start getting into some topics again about China. Trevor, are you there? Have you gone walkabout?
Going to get my coffee. We're back, and I'm back.
We are back in the Middlemen. Right, so this week there's been a lot of interesting stories. There's a lot of stuff going on with China. Things are hotting up, so we couldn't really put things on the back burner. We want to get into some more topics, and I think this week, in the past 2 weeks in China, there's been a story that has gone crazy within the domestic media, particularly in the city where we used to live in Hangzhou, which is about a woman who went missing. Well, at first they thought she was legitimately missing. Her husband reported her missing, I think within 12 hours of him saying that she disappeared. She didn't take any ID, and there was no sign of her taking any clothes. And so it was a great mystery. And one of the reasons why it gained a lot of attention, I think it was because most people think now that it's not possible to really disappear in China. And a lot of this is because of the surveillance state, the amount of cameras that are around in the cities. I did read somewhere, I think a couple of years ago, there's an estimated, this is a staggering number, and that's an estimated 11 billion cameras in China. Now, that's when you factor in mobile phones and things like that, and all those cameras and everything. And then you've got regular cameras, millions of CCTV cameras all across the towns and cities, most notably Hangzhou, which is pretty much home of the highest and the best camera technology, which is like face recognition and stuff like that.
AKA safest city in China.
The safest city in China, and it is. I think we can get into that a bit. So, guys, did you come across this story? Trevor, I think you said you've seen this, right? Coming through on Chinese media.
Oh yeah, I was overhearing my wife just kind of secondhand and obsessively reading about the many takes on this story, and it seemed like it's quite an unraveling, in-depth, well, hate to give spoiler alert, murder case.
Yeah.
That she kept going on and on about quite late. It was late here in the US on the eastern coast, and the story was all being unraveled in China time during the day. And yeah, it's pretty gruesome. Do you want to get into the details, John?
Yeah, we can get into the details, but I think first we need the reason why it became such a popular story. And I think that it's not just the fact is that it was a great mystery, but I think it was like a challenge whether it was possible. When I was talking to my wife, she just said, she was very intrigued by this, because I think most people living in a city in China think that it's impossible to get away, A, with murder, and B, it's impossible to disappear without anyone knowing where you are, because the surveillance is that intensive. And they're not saying that's a bad thing,
Unless you're a billionaire or a high-profile person, in which case you can go disappear for in a certain amount of time, but the expectation is that you will reappear.
Yes, that's right. If you're needed to be disappeared by people who can be disappeared.
But not permanently disappeared. That's a different issue.
Yeah. But for a regular person, if one day you just wake up and you decide you've had enough of your identity, you want to change your life, leave your husband, leave your children, leave your job, leave all your identity behind and try and start a new life in another city, or even attempt to get to another country. Bearing in mind during the COVID pandemic, it's pretty much impossible. I mean, most people would say it would be impossible in China. Lewis, do you think this would be possible in the UK, to just disappear in the UK? Not the murder, to disappear.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be easier, but I mean, I think it depends where you are in China and where you are in the UK, right? I'm sure central London has its fair share of kind of like cameras and surveillance, but I mean, certainly in Hangzhou, the city that we're talking about here, like it's just even just like sort of traffic cameras and stuff, like they you can't get in a car without it, being tracked exactly where you've gone, where you parked for however many minutes or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's I think in China, in sort of the big cities, it would be really difficult to go missing. But I don't know if you were in sort of a rural area in more kind of Western China, that's a different story. But I think this is, I mean, that's kind of like a sort of a recurring theme with China, isn't it? How the sort of developed East Coast and big cities, and then sort of the rural areas are almost like two different worlds.
Yeah. Do you, and Trevor, how about the US? I mean, you hear every year and, about people that just decide to start vagabonding or just, leave behind their life and disappear. You can do it in the States, right? I mean, it's still very much possible if you.
I guess the words would be going off grid in not the literal sense, but just going kind of incommunicado, whether that's like vagabonding and traveling, or shedding your identity and all your roots, or just actually just choosing to live isolated off of the land. That's probably a little bit more common in the US, although it's the exception still from what most people do. But going to this point about China, I will say I remember I was in the northeastern province of Liaoning in Dalian, and once on the subway, and instead of like advertisements, there was actually bounties of fugitives on the subway screens, these LED screens, which would usually in Hangzhou, they'll have advertisements for buy this or try this service. In Dalian, it was bounties, and I was fascinating. First of all, what would it be like as the life of a bounty hunter in China? and second is this question that you're asking, John, is how do you disappear in China? Clearly the people committed the crimes or allegedly committed the crimes. We won't get into the justice system of China yet.
Yeah.
In Dalian, and are no longer in Dalian, because it's almost unbelievable that they in a Dalian, which is a second-tier city, and probably has a high degree of surveillance, far higher than anything in the U.S. or UK or most parts of the world, that you couldn't be unrecognized by that surveillance state. And this is what you're referring to now, right, John?
Yeah, the reach of the surveillance state. I think with Dalian, there are some cities in China where you've probably got more of a chance. Like there's a lot of, it's shipping, right? There's connections between Korea as well. There's probably a lot of boats that go in and out of Dalian, fishing boats and unlicensed, maybe even North Korean boats as well, around the area. So you could.
But this is the point, that you need to get on a boat or leave the country in order to remain undetected.
Yeah. Well, there's one story which I think it became noticeable just how good the facial recognition technology was. And the CCP released this story in all the media, and I think there's a bit of a forewarning. There was a big concert held, I think in 2018. It was an outdoor concert. Was it in Chongqing, Central Asia? I don't think it was in Zhejiang or in Shanghai. I think it was one of the other larger cities. Anyway, thousands of people at this concert, and they had CCTV, facial recognition put up for the purposes of crowd control. Anyway, during this concert, they actually found 3 people that were on a wanted list, on a police wanted list, through their facial recognition. Do you remember this story?
Didn't hear about it. Did you, Lewis?
I didn't hear this story, but it wouldn't surprise me. And one thing that does surprise me though is how Chinese people are very accepting of it. And it's sort of, I think in some ways Chinese people are very, very guarded about their sort of personal information and privacy in ways that we're not in Britain. But then in other ways they're really very accepting of kind of like invasions of privacy where we wouldn't be in Britain. It's their sort of priorities in different places. Like on their their sort of social media accounts, they very, very rarely would you see a Chinese person use their real name.
Right.
Or even less so a real name and a real picture of them.
Right.
They'll have a picture of some like a flower or a Korean pop star, and then they'll have a name that's not, not actually their kind of like, legal name, the same way that you would have your real name on your Facebook account. And if you ask them, it's like, it's all for privacy reasons, which for me is very strange because, on WeChat, like the only people that the only people that can contact you and see your picture and see your profile and see your pictures are people that you've accepted as a friend. It's not like Facebook where anybody can just click on your profile and see you. So it's very, it's a very closed sort of social media is WeChat. So I'm really surprised that they feel the need to not put their picture or their real name on there if they say, as a lot of Chinese people have told me, that it's for privacy reasons. And yet on the other hand, they're very happy to have this like as you said, John, actually a lot of them don't think it's a bad thing that the government can track where they are and what they're doing at every any time of the day. And it's just it's sort of like it's interesting that I think people in in Britain would be much more sort of wary of that kind of like surveillance state and Big Brother and stuff. And all 1984. But in China, they're like, oh yeah, that's normal, that's good, it's not a problem.
We're going to get into it just to say.
But you can't possibly let your own friends see a picture of you on your social media.
Well, look, I actually think that there's some deeper cultural reasons about using the personal name on display. And I think a lot of it can be about they're not as an individualistic society where it's kind of they're happy to put their name out in public. They can be guarded. It's like that standing up as an individual. Maybe that comes from the more collective, the fact that it's a collective society. And going deeper than that, actually in Thailand, and I think this translated into other parts of East Asia as well, people traditionally would never use their full name. They would never speak it. They would never really publish it. And they would use nicknames or short names. And I did some investigation about in Thailand. That's because I couldn't understand why in Thai, no one would actually use their official name or casually with friends. And apparently it stems back to Eastern philosophy, which is maybe pseudo-Buddhism in this case, because I don't remember studying this in Buddhism. But if you speak someone's name, it can give them bad luck. And they actually believe that ghosts can know who you are and these evil spirits can infiltrate you. It's a bit wacky, but this is what they really do believe in Thailand. So over thousands of years, they've adopted the use of nicknames or pseudonyms that they're happy to go by because they felt like publicly speaking the full name of someone would cause someone bad luck or to be basically haunted by evil spirits.
Right.
So
I think, sorry, just like going back to what you said about the collectivist society, I think that's definitely true in China. I'm not sure about sort of the influence of pseudo-Buddhist beliefs on saying somebody's name, but certainly the collective side of it, because they're far more likely to refer to people in terms of their relationship to you rather than their name.
Yeah.
So, like you wouldn't call your wife by her name, you'd call her wife. And you wouldn't call your classmate by their name, you'd call them classmate. Right. And you don't call your boss by his name, you call him boss. It's like, and even even like brother, right? And I mean, I guess we kind of do that with mum and dad in English speaking countries. You wouldn't call your mum and dad by the same name, but they seem to by their name. You'd call them by their relationship to you. But it seems like in China that extends to friendships and work relationships where you don't actually call them by their name, but you more like to call them by their sort of their position in relation to you. Which I guess all that ties in what you said about sort of the whole collectivist society.
Yeah. So, Trevor, just to wrap up this story, this particular story of this woman, do you want to go into a bit more detail how they found out?
Yeah, well, I think the point is they found out not through surveillance, and maybe that's why everyone was shocked. And the details of how it was discovered are quite unique and even more just grotesque and graphic.
Come on, Trevor, tell us. I've not heard the story. I want to know now. 不要买关子好吗?
So I don't know. It's something for like a bad TV show, but apparently she was. I don't know how he did it in the details, but it was done by the husband, obviously, and it's always the husband, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, and he cut his wife into pieces, and then I don't know. Did she get flushed down the toilet, or he was brought the pieces of her remnants were brought into the waste disposal.
Both. I think basically he strangled her in a sleep and then trapped the body and slowly disposed of it in the toilet, and took bits out to the local the sanitation tank outside, and they ended up doing
right. So he didn't actually have to go through the garage or through anywhere there was any kind of surveillance that would make it seem like he was doing something unusual.
He thought about it a lot, and I mean he used the limited areas of where there weren't cameras. So he really did try to get away with murder as much as as possible. But they ended up testing. They did kind of DNA tests on water samples and various I think acid tests, nucleic acid tests, or whatever they are, and they determined that there were human remains. And then they went a bit further into it, and he ended up confessing. I think it would be the usual case of saying that he's going to be spared the death penalty if he confesses. But I think he's, because it's such a high profile case and it's so rare, murder is incredibly rare, especially in the cities, very, very rare, that he will be executed.
Only getting back, the few cases of murder that I do hear about are often quite young. They're like teenagers and love affairs. There was a very high-profile case of overseas Chinese students in Japan a couple years ago, of which a girl was killed by her recent ex. And there was a case in Hangzhou, I think in 2008 or 7, of which there was at a school, a girl was murdered by a jealous lover, another student, and he committed suicide afterwards. And in both of these cases, they're quite brutal, and I guess you would say like crimes of passion.
Yeah, that's it. I think this is like in Minority Report, the film, because I think that was like a kind of glimpse into the Orwellian future. And if you remember in that film, they were really the only crimes that existed, crimes of passion, because anything that was premeditative, they had thought control, they had full surveillance and everything. So the only crimes of the future were desperate crimes of passion, finding your wife in bed with someone or something like that. And China really is getting that way, where these kind of outliers of violent murder behavior, they are just come from these extreme reactions that they can't control. Because I think most people know that they cannot get away with any overt crime in China. Most crime, is very sneaky. It will be internet crime. It will be about identity, anonymous, money laundering or fraud, things like that. But overt, serious, violent crime is virtually nil. And I just wanted to put on one point here, Trevor. So what we're seeing at the minute, obviously with the West, there's been a lot of posturing for the last couple of weeks about the moral argument with China, saying that companies should stop pull out of China. They're talking about Xinjiang a lot with some of this, and we talk about this in the next few weeks. But one of the arguments you hear about Xinjiang is that, these CCTV cameras are often backed by American companies, over these so-called concentration camps or re-education camps. But people need to realize that those same cameras that they use in Xinjiang are also used with the consent of normal Chinese citizens in every city, right? On every corner. When we go to work in Hangzhou or whatever, we're undergoing facial recognition, complete surveillance 24/7. And
yeah, well, it looks like the GPU units, the graphical processing units, are definitely not made in mainland China for the level of surveillance that incorporates whatever different algorithms or AI to recognize on a huge database. That's not, a lot of that technology, the hardware is not made in China, right? This is what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and then they're using that as a moral instrument to say, look, Western companies are in cahoots with the CCP. They're doing something morally corrupt, morally bad. But this same technology is applied to standard Chinese citizens. It's not like it's just within Xinjiang. I think, Lewis, you said about London having CCTV cameras, so forth. Yeah, England was actually the highest. The United Kingdom was the highest in the 2000s. We had the highest rate of CCTV cameras in the whole world. But China has just leapfrogged everyone within the past, 7-8 years. And it's with very much the consent and the willing consent of the people. And I think this is what the West, most people don't realize, is that Chinese people like the cameras because they have this constant talk of safety. It keeps us safe. Trevor, have you ever found, or Lewis, have you ever found anyone in a casual conversation or anything who's overtly or indirectly said that they don't like the cameras?
But I think this might go back to what you said, or what we were sort of mentioning about sort of the collectivist society as well. Like the idea of you as an individual have your individual kind of like, sort of right to not be recognized, to not be sort of, under surveillance from the government is a very individualistic kind of like idea. And in China, where they're, collectivist, much more collectivist, it's like, well, of course, like the government wants to know where you are and what you're doing. I mean, even before the security cameras surveillance come in, it's like, you need to, even in China, like if somebody from one province wants to go and work in another province, or from a rural area in one province wants to come and work in the city in that province, they have to have like, they can't just go there and find a job. They need to have like their hukou. It's like their household registration. And they need to get like, I'm not sure like the specific sort of paperwork they have to do, but they have to do like paperwork, almost like an internal visa, just to get a job in another city. And then, like people have to register where they're living at the sort of, police stations and stuff. It's, there's a lot more sort of restriction and control of people, and they kind of accept that. That's, in China, that's kind of normal. Just like, sorry, on another point, which, maybe going off topic, but it's interesting that you can now like pay for things in China using your face, can't you? They have the facial recognition technology to just, pay for stuff. And I think a lot of people wouldn't want the banks and, the private companies, the kind of Chinese equivalent of like PayPal, knowing that having their facial, sort of their face on their database and stuff. Like, in Britain, there's a huge backlash against the idea of ID cards. Yeah. Could you imagine if the government wanted to create a database of everybody's face so they could recognize where you're going everywhere, and people would willingly opt into this by, just because it would help them to pay for things a little bit quicker in the supermarket. It's just, the way that they think about these things is not the same as we do in Britain.
Yeah. Do you agree with that, Trevor? How do you think in general that the Chinese population of these cities, they're hugely accepting and appreciative of this of the surveillance state.
I mean, when you talk about this, you're talking about like your average citizen's relationship with law enforcement and police, right? And how what you're saying from the early 2000s to recently, there's been an explosion of CCTV cameras, and not necessarily the monitoring and controlling of information online, right? Just the CCTV cameras.
Yeah.
Okay. No one really complains about it. In fact, I was the one often complaining about it, saying they're not used. Because firsthand, there was 2 instances where I had a bicycle stolen, and the window of time was obvious. I found on both occasions, one time in the parking lot under a building, in a garage, parking garage, I should say. And I knew the windows of time. So I went to the building and I said, it was a building where I worked, and I knew the security guard chief. And I asked him to review the footage, and we went through it together. And there it was, sure enough, we talked about this before, right before Chinese New Year, like young, like high 20s male, Han Chinese, goes up to the lock, picks it immediately, and just walks out with the bike like he owns it. And that was earlier on, and I said, why can't we find this guy? And they said, well, because he's in a pretty big demographic. And I thought about it, and I was like, if there's any one single demographic of the world, like 30-year-old Chinese male is the largest single demographic globally. So, and it was not very good footage at that time. Then later on, I actually went to a police station with my bike, which had the lock on it, but it was a small bike, where 2 guys on a motorbike just came up and they put it on, one on the back, just stepped off, picked up the bike, put it on his back, and drove away. And it happened when I was out for a coffee somewhere in less than an hour. So the first thing I did was went right to the local police station, and they found it, and they started laughing. Oh, yep, your bike's gone. And my whole point about that, and since then, is that like there's a double standard. So yeah, there are all these cameras, but things like petty crime, like thievery, petty theft, there's no implementation of these same things. And to think that there's no crime, that there's a true Minority Report kind of situation is not true at all. There's a lot of thievery. There's a lot of like
petty
tax
crime.
evasion. There's so much crime in China. This is not changing probably. But
Trevor, it's not violent crime. That I mean, in the cities,
right.
It's not confrontational, overt violent crime. This is sneaky, petty crime, and there is a lot of it. Yeah, that's right. I agree with that.
So like, yes, murder, you're not going to get away with it in China. And this is another case, even without the surveillance system, because the loss of life, the unnecessary loss of life, is a very serious transgression. And that most of the time the punishment for a murder is like, there's no separation of murder and manslaughter.
Yeah,
it's murder, and you're going away for life at best, if not getting capital punishment. So
it's not. It's also
the extremes of it all are what I found so ridiculous. Like, petty crime is a problem with society. If there's a lot of thieves around and people are just taking from each other, there's a reason for it, and there could be poverty or homelessness. You can get into that.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't be tolerated at any cost. And then also in murder, there's a lot of complexities too. Also, just like getting into the motive of this case that everyone's talking about. How does this happen? And what's wrong with this individual? No one's really getting into that as much. It's more about how he got away with it and the details of how he did it.
Well, I think it was they're talking about life insurance, and he was in some debt, and maybe he had a concubine as well, the usual stuff. But look, with the stuff with the petty crime, you're saying it's not enforced. They could do it. They could find that guy with the technology they wanted to. Anyone who steals a bike, it is possible. It is that extensive, but there's always a human being at the end of some of this, and there's bureaucracy and there's paperwork that needs to be done, and
Right.
there's boxes that need to be ticked, and this takes effort. And then we go into the whole idea of how lazy the bureaucracy can be in implementing it, or actually bothering to go through the whole process. That's like a human decision at the end. These police officers are busy drinking tea, and they know that a bike theft is not going to ruffle the feathers of any senior politicians. But when you start getting into murder or big transgressions, then they know that they're going to get the heat on them. So they know they've got no choice but to get up off their chair, put the cup of tea down, and start using the technology to its full capacity. But for someone stealing a bicycle, you're right, no one's really going to put the man hours in and fill out the paperwork to go through that. But I believe
Sorry guys, I'm gonna have to go. But
okay.
So my thoughts on this, where it's kind of been quite sort of interesting. Usually when you bring up this question of why isn't this enforced in China, blah blah, the set response is 中国人太多了. Oh, there's too many Chinese people. We can't do it. And what and for me, the interesting thing with this whole sort of coronavirus situation is that it's not there's too many Chinese people. When they want to enforce something,
Right.
they really can in China. They can enforce it. If they want everybody in the country to wear a mask or stay at home and not leave the house, they can do that.
Right.
It's not a case of there's too many people in China. It's a case of it's not a priority for them.
The bureaucracy is difficult to get things done, like John was saying.
Yeah.
Sorry, I wasn't really listening to what you were saying, so maybe I was going off topic there. But I'm gonna have to go now anyway, guys.
Me and Trevor will finish off for 10 minutes, and we'll catch you next week.
But yeah, great chatting to you, and I'll speak to you guys next week.
All right, mate. I'll speak to you soon. Okay.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.
All right. So. Right, this is. I think we just need to surmise things at this end with the surveillance state, because this is what we're getting at, is the extent of the surveillance state. One is that I think the West need to understand that the Chinese don't consider themselves suppressed or even repressed by the surveillance state. They're actually, for the most part, welcoming of it. And number two, actually, which is the bigger question, China probably is is a much safer country when it comes to violent crime and things like that. But do the Chinese actually feel safe now? What do you think? Do you think that they're actually at this where your average Chinese person is feeling a lot safer, where their mind is at ease now?
No, I don't think so.
No, I don't, because I tell you what, I've never. Right.
Yeah.
For me, Hangzhou is the safest place I've ever been. And I've been to nearly 90 countries, hundreds of different cities. And, you are happy. I would be more than happy for my wife to walk through the streets of Hangzhou at 2:00 in the morning, 1:00 in the morning, or anything like that. That's by herself in my home.
John, you wouldn't be happy, but you would have no objections or.
Well, I would have no objections to it, and I wouldn't be fearing for her life. I would not fear about, even locking my door to an extent, although there is fear around. But you ask about the China, you ask people face to face in China, they still feel scared. They're still very cautious. It's still even this extensive amount of Orwellian surveillance. They like it, but I don't think it's actually made them feel safe. They've still got this ongoing fear about many, many, many different things. I don't know. What do you think? That's off the mark, or do you think that sounds about right?
It's a big generalization, but what do Chinese really fear? Not growing old, health problems, their children's education, financial security. I think that it's a bit of complacency also, that your average Chinese person in Hangzhou, at least, didn't necessarily fear violence before there was lots of surveillance, because a lot of these places were also safe cities before, or had reputations as being, perceived as being safe cities before there was surveillance, including Hangzhou.
Mm.
And that maintaining that was surveillance became a part of that, a tool of law enforcement for violent crime and drug abuse and things like that. But I don't know. Like, what do you think? You're really, I don't know. This is a big question. I think we can turn this back and say, in terms of law enforcement, what other types of crimes, like where do some things get caught in between? Clearly, petty crime is tolerated, and then like we've talked about this in the past in the Middlemen, like
Well,
drug abuse and drug distribution is not
not
tolerated
tolerated, no.
at all.
There's trickery
Murder,
and
violence is
fraud.
not tolerated.
The
So,
I mean, they try and crack down on the trickery and fraud of things, but also they're kind of appreciative of how smart some of the fraud, this fraud can be. They don't like it and they don't endorse it. But I'll give you an example. So you might have heard of this one. So Sherry, this was going back a few years. She was in a final year of university, and her mother received a phone call, and the phone call said that they had kidnapped her daughter, which was Sherry. This is before I knew her, and that they were demanding a ransom to be paid over WeChat of like 2,000 RMB, which would be like $300. And if they didn't pay it, they were going to hurt her. And they had a female voice screaming in the background with muffled sound. Sherry's mom was beside herself, and and then called her Sherry's dad. He came to the phone, and he basically was like, "Ni xie." He was like, "Who are you?" And he was like, "Oh, I know this is a trick," because he read it in the news or it happened to one of his friends.
mm-hmm.
So he just told them to fuck off, basically, and put the phone down, and then phoned Sherry on a phone, and he was like, "Right, you're not kidnapped." But that's quite a common, they would get the numbers, and the people who are doing this may well have been students or younger people just trying to make quick money. But people kind of not laugh about it. They kind of think it's a bit smart to try it, like these ingenious ways to try and to make money. But that was quite a common one. Did you hear about that kind of thing?
It is. I'm curious of why you also mentioned this in terms of fraud, and that it is tolerated, but specifically about kidnapping, which I haven't heard so many about this. However, I will say that I have heard a lot of children being kidnapped in major Chinese cities and it not being pursued to its fullest.
Yeah, that's a bit weird. Well, that's going back a few years, right? I think. I don't think that's in the recent.
There was even a case in Shanghai last year, 2019, in which there was a very high-profile case that people can only speculate why it was ultimately, because the whole idea of this surveillance state is that you can follow, once you recognize one person, there's a trail of infinite cameras that can follow them 24 hours a day in an inside and outside of buildings. So you can know where people have come from or where they're going to, depending on the crime. And if it's kidnapping, you can definitely identify where people are, so long as they're in cities, and that they've been in a car or in public transportation. So you could find where the child is or was taken to, and you can find out who did it and where they live, essentially, or where their family lives. And then essentially get to the bottom of this. But there are cases of children going missing, and like within a brief moment of their parents didn't watch at the park, or grandparents more often, and it hasn't been pursued, which I always thought was strange.
Well,
but it's not quite as common as what you're getting at, like fraud.
No, it's not common. But let me tell you about my feeling about the missing children, because I talked about this with a few people. Now, to push, don't forget, whenever the CCP still don't just impose things, shall we say, overnight willy-nilly. There's still background justification to it. right? And one of the justifications for thing is keeping people scared. Now, I always think that some of these big cases that make the news or the media, obviously because they make the national news, they're always sanctioned at some kind of level. To have, or to maybe turn a blind eye to, you know, a child getting kidnapped and for it to be on national news and installing this fear in people, and especially because it's children, the mothers, again, is a good way to justify living in a surveillance state. And people will applaud it. You know, as with everything, governments, they often legitimize fear and use it when needed. Fear is a useful tool for governments, right? You need to keep the people scared to a degree, so you know what's better for them. And this instance goes back to the DD murders. So for those of you listening that want to know what DD is, it's basically Uber. And it kind of overtook Uber for other reasons in China, and everyone uses a DD to get around. And you're talking millions and millions and millions of transactions and DD rides every day throughout China. Very good, very efficient. But 3 years ago, was it 3 years or 2 years? 3 years, right? I think. The murder, when the driver.
I think it was 2 years ago.
2 years. God, it's been a long time. Okay, so it seems a long time ago. So a young girl, tragically, she was murdered by a DD driver. I mean, we won't go into details, but it was tragic, it was horrific, and it was massive, massive news, to the point where they actually suspended the service, didn't they? I think for the whole of DD closed down for like 2 or 3 days. They had to, and under pressure, they had to create all these additional safety features, which were actually stronger surveillance features, basically. And everyone was applauding them. Basically, it was kind of like, yes, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, we need to have full GPS tracking. We need to have this or that or whatever.
Listening into rides.
Yeah, listening to rides, basically have full, all these onboard panic buttons. And this stuff happens, companies in the West will do this as well. There's always a reaction to a tragedy and then maybe an overreach or an overreaction. But, that stories don't get that big. If you want to suppress a story, the government can do it without a shadow of a doubt. We've already talked about that. So they know that that's quite useful for them. They know that it's going to leave people unquestionably welcoming stronger surveillance, which is what it did.
But a lot of the time, that's when, like, these examples are when it's dealt with and when there's like a efficient means of dealing with it, like this case of the murder. Like there was a lot of very scientific, very good forensic police work that was done that led to this case becoming revealed. Similar in the DD case, where it was a lot of, we'll get some of the details were like how DD, this ride sharing app, kind of, you had drivers could comment and reference the some of the people that were taking their rides, and they often started building up reputations of how attractive girls were. So you could just see the profile of a potential passenger, if it was male, female, and what other drivers had said about them. And that was part of it. And the other thing was the girl who ended up getting murdered on this ride had notified DD customer service that something was wrong with her driver and that she didn't feel safe. Yeah. And they assured her that everything was fine, that her driver's reputation was intact, and they have his ID and everything. And sure enough, that backfired. That let out to the police. So that was kind of a warning to all social media apps to avoid any potential unnecessary risk and have their customer service take any of these, de-escalate any situation and prevent the loss of life in this case, which was completely unnecessary. So these are, and this is where like overregulation helped, and good police work, good police training led to this murder case. But the instance I'm talking about in child kidnapping, I mean, what are you trying to say? That like, parents should be more careful?
No, not at all. I'm saying that, not to the extent of a conspiracy, where the state would be complicit in it. But I'm saying that to let things slide, or maybe not to thoroughly investigate certain, the mystery, put it this way, the mystery of having an unsolved mystery of a missing child is more of a powerful forewarning or feeling given to people than having it solved. You know, it's like still kind of like having the boogie monster. Is that what you say in the States? The boogie monster, right?
Yeah, boogie monster.
You know, this is, and all governments do this. This isn't just China. Every government in the world will you know, use this concept of fear to control people. And, you know, you can justify it. You can say, look, even one death is too many. But let's not forget, you know, the reactions to something very infinitesimally small, as tragic as it is then impounded upon 1.4 billion people. You know what I mean? It's like, that's a lot of reach, 1.4 billion people. So I'm not saying it's conspiracy. I'm not saying that things are allowed to happen, but I personally still, when I speak to my Chinese friends, and particularly all the Chinese female students in their 20s and in their 30s that I used to know that used to come to school, to the adult training school, we used to talk about safety, and they actually didn't think China was, they thought it was safe and safer than America, because obviously America has guns, is what they always say. But they would not say that it was completely safe. And they said that I was careless by thinking it was so safe, you know, that there wouldn't be murder or someone wouldn't attack me or wouldn't be you know, there wouldn't be any fighting, because I was just adamant. I just said, you know, Hangzhou is 100% safe. The worst thing that can happen is I can get my bike stolen. Someone can try and trick me from money, or if I'm not looking where I'm going, I'll get hit by a car in the road because the drivers are dangerous. And I still stand by that. You know, I still think that's basically tier 1 and tier 2 cities all across China. Maybe up north, I think in the north there's a bit more physicality, right? There can be some fighting occasionally, guys drinking too much, but
fights, domestic violence, stuff like that is more common.
But domestic violence again isn't you know, this is a matter. This is not a thing really that is prosecuted or seen as.
Oh, that's another issue as well. There's a lot of tolerating domestic violence as a personal, none of your business kind of thing, including the police. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you know, my story when I was, you know, I was involved, not in domestic violence, but my neighbor kicked down his door when I was living in those serviced apartments, 2:00 in the morning. They were having, and they always used to fight, this boyfriend, girlfriend, and they kicked down his door. She locked him out. He kicked down the door, woke up everyone up. Everyone stayed in the rooms apart from me. And I was like, what the fuck?
Good morning.
And then they started scuffling, and she was saying, I couldn't understand it, but Sherry was telling me to come back in, and she was like, she was saying, I'm going to phone the police, and he was like, don't bother. And eventually the security guard came up. He just smoked a cigarette watching them fight, and I was like, this is fucking ridiculous. And she was going crazy, but he was manhandling her severely, you know, enough for the police to step in. And then when the police did come, I think the security guard phoned because they wouldn't calm him down. They just said, yeah, these things happen. They just walked up, basically. And he then locked himself in the room, and she sat outside in the corridor sobbing all night, sleeping on the floor, basically. So, I mean, that the whole thing of domestic violence, they see it as it's not the state's responsibility. What happens behind closed doors, stay behind closed doors, which used to be a lot of a Western ideal as well. And in a sense, you know, that
long ago,
yeah, you know, the West has kind of overextended behind the closed door now. So in some respects, China do feel that they've got this bubble of privacy, you know, in their house. But as soon as they step out their house, that's it. They're basically under full surveillance, which is the truth, you know.
Right, John. So Did you see some of the speaking of we won't get too much into it, but did you see, speaking of surveillance, the footage that was released from Xinjiang at a train stop, I think it was, major
Yeah,
transportation hub?
yeah,
Well, that was a leak, clearly a leak, and you can see in the beginning parts of it, some of the windows that are open are Kali Linux, which is a hacking tool. Um, so this brings up, I mean, we won't get into what was seen, but clearly that's the kind of thing that the state in China does not want to be released. And I mean, you've got to imagine the highest level of surveillance technology is being implemented in the region of Xinjiang for obvious reasons, yet it's still being hacked, meaning, and this is something else that I hadn't thought about before, but since getting more into information security, cybersecurity, if you will, there's clearly a backdoor issue with some of the technology that's being implemented. And I never heard once people in China bringing up a concern about if there was this surveillance footage is not privy only to the state's municipal or provincial or national states in China, but potentially organized crime, potentially any kind of hacking group or any other nation state in the world could have access to a lot of this footage. Some of which is very private, some of which is.
I mean, I'm not sure that the footage of it was drone footage of it flying over. Now, it could be, it might not have been a state drone. I mean, I'd be very surprised if it was like a spy drone from a foreign source being able, because I think the Chinese have blocking devices and things along for that. Yeah, it's a bit of a weird one how that footage got out, because I can pay testament, having flown through Urumqi and Xinjiang. It's the craziest, most the only other airport that was similar to that was Israel Airport. When I went through that, it took ages to get in. They took absolutely everything, pens off me. I wasn't allowed to travel with a pen when I boarded the flight. Really, really hard.
This is your flight to Urumqi.
Yeah, this is flying. I had to fly from Urumqi and then board a plane to Kazakhstan to not Astana, Almaty. So I had a few hours in the airport there, and it wasn't very pleasant, to be honest. It was pretty on top. So I mean, yeah, we can't really get too much into the Xinjiang thing because I've got a lot to say about it and a lot to.
Yeah, it's more about just how the surveillance leakage happened, and if people, there is a potential for a major footage of Chinese surveillance leaking higher than ever, because the more systems that are put into place, the more potential there is, like a vulnerability that can be exploited. So.
And this leads me one of my final anecdotes, which probably Sherry has not. Well, she's left that job now because she'll be here soon. But I can say this. It's not it. So in Hangzhou Airport, she was responsible for a lot of the security with the cameras, CCTV for all the car parks, internal kind of cameras around shopping areas, peripheral cameras, and things like that. So. It was actually kind of an outsourced company that does it, but officially she still worked for Hangzhou Airport. Mm-hmm. So on several occasions, there's been stuff recorded that she was told to delete straight away. Mm-hmm. And the last important one, and I've not told you this story yet because it's pretty funny. This happened about a month ago, and a guy parked his new Mercedes straight outside the arrivals hall. Strictly no parking. Do you know what I mean? No one would really. It's where it's all yellow lines, drop-offs only, pedestrian access. He just drove right up to the doors, parked his Mercedes there, and just walked straight in. Complete no-no. Anyway, 2 police turn up straight away to look at this car. They start ticketing it, getting the license plate. They phone up the CCTV Sherry. They say, zoom onto the license plate. Let's get some details, all of this. Anyway, about 30 minutes later, this guy saunters out casually with his mother, and he's like, "Hey, what's the problem?" And then like the policeman gives him some aggro, and the guy turns around straight away and smacks the policeman, clocks him one, like knocks him to the floor, and he's
Wow.
on the floor. And Sherry's watching all this in real time, and
This was not news. This was not in the news.
She is like, "What the fuck?" and so the other policeman wrestles this guy. The mother's screaming. He tells the mother to get in the car. The one policeman gets this guy down. They don't cuff him, but get the arm behind his back. Anyway, they cart him off. Sherry follows them through to the cameras. They go to a room, and and basically, turns out a phone call was made that this man is someone who knows someone, and the police let him go with a shake of the hand and said that won't happen again, and you're welcome to park anywhere, basically. And then the phone call came through to make sure that video footage gets snipped, basically. So and that's the most extreme example, but she had a few of these. So I think there's also a constant monitoring of, like you're right, of things that are not just leaked, but are recorded that people don't want recorded. And if you know the right people who are in charge of that, that stuff has to disappear quickly because they don't.
Amazing story, John. This was not news. I've never even heard anything remotely close to like that.
Well,
yeah.
I saw it happen in Thailand, but nothing in China. But she saw it with her own eyes.
This could open up the a door to new conversation in terms of entitlement.
Guanxi, the big Guanxi.
Yeah, Guanxi, entitlement, and other things that are unique to the rich and powerful, or whoever you want to say, in China, and how that differs from the West.
Let's make a final assessment on this then. Surveillance in China, good or bad thing? Maybe it's not a black and white issue. I'll go first. This is my assessment, and I can't say good or bad. What I will say, is China the safest country in the world? Well, are Chinese East Coast cities the safest places in the world? I would probably say yes. Having traveled the world extensively, there are still dangerous elements. There is still crime. It is very, very safe. Does that make Chinese people the most moral, upholding the strongest morals in the world? If there's less crime there, does that mean that Chinese have higher morals than Europeans or Africans? I would say no, and I think most Chinese people would agree with me. Okay, so I think that the surveillance has definitely had a very powerful impact on reducing crime rate and making things safer. Is that a good thing long term? Are there benefits to having a little danger in society? I think so. I think there needs to be a risk to everything. I don't think things should be 100% safe and guaranteed. I think there are valuable qualities to having certain amounts of risk, maybe light confrontation in society, not revolution or complete downfall of society, but I don't think you can wrap society in cotton wool. I don't think it's ultimately a good thing. That's kind of my final take on it. How about you? Where are you on it?
Do I get the last word?
Yeah, you get the last word.
Wow, I'm gonna revel in this for a minute. We're supposed to be in the Middlemen, but I'm gonna have to edge on the side of agreement. I'm gonna agree with you once, John.
Okay.
And say that a vast majority of CCTV surveillance, not necessarily online content monitoring and information control, the CCTV surveillance is overall a prevailing good. Whether it's like just traffic crimes, like police don't pull you over in the middle of the street. If you think about it, completely unnecessarily, you get a fine sent to you, and then over a period of time, whether it's parking poorly or reckless driving, you can lose your points in your license. It's a much more efficient system for just traffic alone, as an example. And then also in the case of violent crime and murder, the murder rate is going way down in 50 plus cities in China, which are a big part of the population. And there's no reason to say that that's it's nothing cynical about that either. It's a good thing, even if it's whatever, wrapped in cotton wool. So there are concerns, like I said before, about who has access to a lot of this footage. But eventually, how is implementing all of the surveillance? Is there in-home surveillance? There's speculation about this in certain parts of China. People basically living in house arrest, whether it's for whatever reasons. That's a bit of a line to cross, but there's not too much evidence of that happening at widespread. And then what are the other large-scale issues? I mean, non-confrontation and getting complacent towards crime. I don't know. These are things that are they that bad? People take for granted how safe they are. That's when you're dealing with good problems in society. So I'm gonna have to side with you on this, that it's overall a prevailing good of.
I think there's still a question mark, like I say. I think in terms of long-term ingenuity for society and driving society forward, maybe it's not a good thing to have this kind of 100% complete blanket. And valuing privacy, freedom, it has got the West a long way to a point. But maybe the technology is at such where, I think it's not just China that's going to surrender that, but maybe the whole world's probably going to follow suit.
Yeah. But you said yourself, most of the time, the police don't necessarily intrude on people's privacy or in their home, and there's only extreme hearsay cases of surveillance being put into people's homes.
That's the difference with Xinjiang and.
I didn't want to bring that up specifically, but in any case, that would be considered a massive violation, irregardless of where or why of privacy. But overall, that's not how 11 billion or X amount of surveillance is being implemented in China. Even if petty crimes are not being done now, I mean, there's probably more of a likelihood that they will if other crimes, whether that's drug trafficking or human trafficking or violent crimes, are decreasing to a point where they're almost negligent, then obviously things like petty crimes will be more addressed. You'd like to think as a natural progression of law.
When we have this moralistic question of because China has been this secular society for long without an ingrained religion as an institution, where if you had the opportunity to commit a crime, would you take it? And then a lot of Chinese students, they say they wouldn't, but they would expect people to do it. Whereas I think in the West, and America in particular, in many areas, because we talk about the Wild West and things in America, but it probably actually wasn't that wild when you look at some of the real history. That we had this code of moral conduct where, people would interact, and for the most part, people wouldn't, be criminal opportunists. They wouldn't, if someone's door was open, they wouldn't go and steal something. When, like as Aristotle would say, something very virtuous is when to do the right thing when no one's looking. Basically, that's kind of one of the foundations of Western civilization.
Integrity.
Even when no one's looking, try and do the right thing. And I know this sounds bad, but I do think that within Chinese culture, it probably is more opportunistic. They see that, especially if maybe they don't have as much social mobility, that if there's an opportunity which presents itself, maybe it would be taken.
Yeah. Oh man, we could talk a whole lot about that, but I can definitely say that things like integrity and doing the right thing is in China entirely circumstantial and relative.
That's
and therefore integrity based on moral principles you know, in the terms of like a Kant or Aristotle, like you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah.
Is you just throw it out the door, out the window in China.
Yeah, you're right. Circumstantial. And so the thing is, in China, it's like, it's not like we have this imaginary, in the West, we've dealt with this imaginary person looking over your shoulder, whether it's God or whether it's, you know, virtuous behavior. You know, so we try and do the right thing. So in China, they've created the actual reality of someone looking over your shoulder, which is the state, you know. But the thing is, it's Machiavellian, right? It achieves the same thing. So actually, if you're achieving this platitude of stability, then you have to ask yourself, well, hey, you know, the ends justifies the means, maybe. So I don't know. I think it's a good. I think we've had a good conversation. We've covered some quite good bits, mate. So
yeah, surveillance. Put it in the men in the middlemen. Check.
Middlemen, we're back.
We can
All right.
revisit it. We can revisit it if one of our many subscribers requests.
I think we're going to start pushing it soon. I'm going to stop recording anyway now. Okay.